It was some decades ago, I think, I was at the Engadine meeting. Do you all remember the Engadine meeting? I'm sure that Greg and Barbara do. And McKinley's, and yeah, there they are, up the back there. The Collises were there, the O'Neills were there, and McGoverns, Heffernans, many, many years ago. And it was in the day, you might remember, when the chairman would sit here for the whole meeting. He wouldn't abscond like he has this morning. He was stuck there for the whole meeting, and the bread and the wine was on the table in front and would be handed out from there. And the poor speaker used to have a chair just off to the right of the chairman, and he sat there for the whole meeting. He had to take the bread and the wine out there, and he sat there and everybody could watch him trying to sing. They were the days that thankfully are gone. And it was on one of those days that I was there, and it was my duty to give the talk for the day. And John O'Neill was in the chair, and I remember it as if it was yesterday. John, as most people did then, the chairman would turn around and tell any welfare issues to the speaker in case they wanted to mention them. And John just turned to me and he said, "Did you hear Katie Joseph died?" And I don't know whether I went numb from my feet up or my whole body went numb. She was a beautiful child, absolutely beautiful. Not only to look at, but in nature. A lovely, lovely child. And so many prayers had been made as she'd become sicker and sicker. And I don't know, as I said, whether I was numb all over immediately or whether it just grew on me, but I do know that I left my notes behind. I left them under my chair. I don't know what I was going to speak on that day, probably Jephthah or Deborah or something, but I didn't. I left the notes under my chair. I can't remember what I said that day, but there was just this cry of, why? After so many prayers, where was the answer to the statement, ask and I'll give you, seek and you'll find, knock and I'll open it to you? And years later, I used to go down to Badalla regularly and call in to all the folks down there every maybe 2 or 3 years, and I used to call into Alicia's place. And there on the mantel shelf there was Katie at 9 and Megan at 6. And the next time I'd go there was Katie at 9 and Megan was 9. And the next time I'd go Katie was 9 and Megan was 15. And on occasions I've still visited Katie's grave at the Badalla Cemetery. It was it's a lovely little cemetery. So much more intimate than the ones that we have. And so you ask why? Why was it that the prayers were not answered? And the question of answered prayer has been asked by believers through the ages. Was it lack of faith? Is it only the prayer of faith, of extreme faith, that's answered? Well, if that's true, I might as well give up. I can tell you that. I don't know anyone who has more faith in that family. There's got to be more to it than that. If you look on the internet and just Google unanswered prayer, you'll see lots of people have said lots of things about it. Some of them are kind and well-meaning, and some of them are quite silly. Some of them border on being wicked, as far as I can see. To suggest to someone whose child has died that it was a lack of faith is not only to see them suffering the loss, but to tell them that it was their fault. To add guilt onto the suffering that they've already experienced. And surely that's not what it's about. Or sometimes people say, oh, well, it's not God's timing. God's timing is something different. And my mind goes back to those poor Christians who were burnt at the stake or thrown to the lions in front of the Roman crowds. And can you imagine their prayer would have been, God, you saved Daniel from the lions, you shut their mouth, save us. Just imagine what a sign that would be in front of 25,000 screaming Romans for the lions to all roll over. And it didn't happen. They were killed. And there are people who claim that it's not God's timing. That's why he didn't answer your prayer. Well, what timing do you need if you've got half an hour to live? Half an hour before you're thrown to the lions. What's God going to say? I'll answer your prayer in 6 months' time? We've all asked why, always. At some stage in our life, all of us have asked why things happen. The world is full of suffering. You've only got to go back to the story in Eden, and whether you take that to be allegorical or whether you take it to be literal. Men turned their back on God and walked away from God and chose to work out wisdom for themselves, and ever since we've suffered. Always. And suffering is a consequence of being human. There's one phrase I really liked of Jesus, or a sentence of Jesus that I really liked when he addresses this. He addresses what happens when meaningless things happen in our life. When we suffer, how do we face it? And it's out of Luke 13. I'll just read it. Verse 4. Or those 18 who died when the tower in Siloam fell on them. Do you think that they were more guilty than all others living in Jerusalem? I tell you no. But unless you repent, you too will perish. Jesus was taking a meaningless event. The tower that fell on those people in Siloam and killed 18 did not kill a select 18. They were not the most wicked people. They were not the worst that lined up there for the tower to fall on them. It was just a random act of sadness. Families were crying over this. It's like an earthquake in Turkey that killed 50,000 people. It's like a tsunami on Boxing Day that killed 250,000 people. These things happen, and then Jesus makes them what I think is a profound statement. He says, but beware, repent, unless the same thing happens to you. Now, he wasn't suggesting that a tower was going to fall on them. He was suggesting to them that life is tenuous. You can be alive today and dead tomorrow. Things happen. Prepare yourself for it. Repent. Come to God. Give yourself to God now in case a tower falls on you. And what he was telling him to do was to impose meaning on a meaningless act. This act of the falling tower had no meaning. It was just an accident. Like the death of a child. Like the death that we lament this morning of Matthew. These things happen. But what he was asking his disciples to do was to impose a meaning on those acts that they didn't have in themselves. Take a warning from it and say, this is God telling me that my life could be taken at any moment. And he says, be careful, because you too could perish. Then there was a time in John chapter 9 when they went along and they saw a man who was blind from birth. His disciples asked him and said, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened that the works of God might be displayed in him. Again, Jesus imposes a meaning on a meaningless act. This person was born blind, what? Because of some sin. This was common in the old world to think that you somehow suffered because of some sins you'd committed, and that a child would be born blind or deaf or lame as a consequence of something evil that you had done. And of course we know now that is not true. Jesus spent so much time trying to tell them that was not true. The whole book of Job was given to us by God to tell us that was not true. But they still believed it. The disciples still thought that bad people get punished. So Jesus said, now impose another meaning on it. It's got nothing to do with being punished. That's not what it's about. It's about looking at this person who is suffering, because this person was a child of Abraham, or if you like, a child of Adam. And this person was suffering the consequences of what we all suffer when we turned our back on God in Eden, as I said, allegorically or literally, whichever you like to take. And so Jesus said, The real meaning is this one would have the works of God displayed in him. But this child was blind so that Jesus was going to be able to heal him and people would see the healing of Jesus. I don't think that's what Jesus was talking about. Look, at one level, yes, Jesus was going to heal him. But then what do we make of every other child born blind, or every other child born deaf, or every other child born lame? Or in sickness, children that die. If it's just this one person that Jesus was going to heal, that was the only meaning, and what do we make of all the rest? Now, I'm sure Jesus meant something deeper than that. I think he meant, look at this child. This child is suffering because of the consequences of humanity, because of what we brought upon ourselves thousands of years ago. But there's a way out. There is a way out of this. When John the Baptist sent his messengers to come to Jesus, they said, "Are you the one who should come, or do we look for someone else?" And Jesus could have just said, "Yes, I'm the one. Off you go." But he didn't. He said to them, "Go and tell John, the blind see, the lame are healed, the deaf hear, and the poor have the gospel preached unto them." Go and tell him that. That gives meaning to everything. That gives meaning to him being in jail. It gives meaning to John suffering. But it gives meaning to every person who's ever suffered. And Jesus says, take that, impose that meaning. And I think that was the meaning on this sightless child. The power of God's going to restore every eye, every ear, every leg that can't walk. One day will be restored, every single one. And Jesus said, put your faith in that. And so, the rest of that chapter, of course, Jesus uses that blind person to preach the gospel, the fact that Jesus is the light that came into the world. It is Jesus that's the light. The physical light doesn't mean anything. Every one of us are born blind. It's not one of us in this room that we're not born blind. Every person ever lived has been born blind. And until you see the light of Jesus and you see the purpose in your life, and you can see the distance and the end and the promise of God for an everlasting kingdom and a world with no suffering, then you've missed the message. And the widow of Zarephath. The prophet Elijah said to the king that it was not going to rain on the earth by the space of 3.5 years. And during that time, God sent him down by a little creek, fed him with ravens. Ravens came with bits of meat and bread in their mouth and fed him while there until the creek dried up. And a slight diversion. Have you ever wondered why God picked ravens to feed him? Ravens were unclean birds. Ravens were birds of carrion. Ravens live on roadkill. They don't go and attack live food very often, sometimes, but mostly not. You know, they're dirty birds. That's why they're unclean under the law. The Jewish people weren't to touch them. And God chose them to feed Elijah. And I often liken it to, can you imagine an Orthodox Jew who's really hungry and a pig walks in the room with a sandwich in its mouth? Is that Jew going to take the sandwich out of the pig's mouth and eat it? Well, that's what Elijah did. And there's a reason for that. And then he goes up to Zarephath and he meets this woman. And he says, give me something to eat. She said, look, I've only got a little bit of flour and a little bit of olive oil left. That's all I've got. I was just going to make a little meal for my son before we die. And he said, look, make one for me first. If you make a meal for me first, I'll promise you that the flour will never run out and the oil will never run out and you'll be saved for the length of the famine. And so she did. And then, what appears to be a meaningless tragedy happens. Her child dies. And here she imposes her meaning on it. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? She imposed exactly the same meaning the disciples had imposed on the blind person. I'm being punished for my sins. Which of course was not true. But Elijah then restored the child to life, and then she changed the meaning that she imposed. She saw then that it wasn't a punishment for her sin, because suddenly the child was living again. And then she said, now I know you are a man of God. And she changed, and now the meaning she imposed was that this was proof that Elijah was the man of God. And the Shunammite woman, when the prophet Elisha was looked after by her, she made a little room on the top of her house. She was quite wealthy, had an old husband, nothing wrong with that. And she said to her husband, what will we do for the prophet? And he said, let's put a little room and we'll put a little bed there and a lamp. I often wonder what poor old Gehazi got. Elisha always went around with his servant, and they built a room for Elisha and gave him a bed and a table. I don't know, poor old Elisha probably got to sleep with the cows, I don't know. Sorry, Gehazi. But he said, Elisha said, what should we do? And the woman said, I've got everything, I don't need anything, thanks. And Gehazi said, look, she's got no children and her husband's old. So the prophet said, this time next year when I come round again, you'll have a child. And then, of course, the child grew and the child died. And she said, did I ask you for a son, my Lord? Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes? Another meaning is that there was no purpose to the child dying. But the child was raised from the dead. But that doesn't happen often, does it? Doesn't happen ever. In our societies, we don't see children raised from the dead. But the purpose is still there. That giving a meaning to what is a meaningless act. And I often think of Acts chapter 12 too, when people must have questioned things that happened, particularly, I guess, unanswered prayer. It was a time when Herod decided to kill some of the church. He took James and he killed James with the edge of the sword. And I assume that means beheading. I can't be sure of that, but I assume beheading was the normal thing in those days. And whereas that sounds pretty grim, it's a pretty good way to go. I would think that in those days you would be pretty lucky to be beheaded. But he died. And then when Herod saw that it pleased everybody, he took Peter and put Peter in jail as well, with the thought of beheading him after the holiday season. So all the saints made great prayer for him. They prayed for Peter so passionately. And then an angel of the Lord came and opened the jail and took Peter back, and Peter came back to the house where all the disciples were, and he was there and knocking on the door, and poor little Rhoda came up and said, "Who is it?" And he says, "Peter." And she said, "Can't be." She ran inside to the disciples and said, "It's Peter at the door. It's Peter's there." And they said, "No, it must be his messenger." Like when John the Baptist was in jail, he sent messengers to Jesus. He must have been sending messengers because he's in jail. And when they finally opened the door, it was Peter. And everybody rejoiced because Peter had been restored and brought back to them, and he'd been saved. And how do you think Zebedee's family felt? How do you think the family of Zebedee felt that James had been killed? And so they had to impose a meaning. The whole church had to impose a meaning. Why James had to follow in the footsteps of Jesus to the cross, but Peter was let go. I've imposed my meaning on it. I think Peter had a specific job to do. I think there was a job that only Peter could do. A Paul couldn't do it, a John couldn't do it, a Jude couldn't do it. No one could do this job except Peter. And I think he was saved for that job. But that's my imposition. The Bible doesn't say that. And how many times do we ask why when things happen in our life? And if only we could see that the reason is always that we have a reminder of our total dependence on God, and no matter what happens in our life, it's to fish us back to God and to make that connection that all our hope forever is in what God has promised. Poor old Job, greatest man alive. God looked at Satan and said, "Have you seen my servant Job? There is none like him on the face of the earth, a man who loves righteousness and turns his back on evil." Are you familiar with who God picked as the most righteous people who've ever lived? Beside Jesus. Up to the time of Ezekiel, God picked 3 people as being the most righteous. He said, if these people lived in your evil community, they would save only their own lives by their righteousness. And he picked the most righteous 3. Noah, Job, and Daniel. Not the ones the Jews would have picked. Where was Abraham? Where was David? Where was Moses? They're not there. And the reason why the Jews turned their back on Noah was he wasn't a Jew. And the reason why they turned their back on Job was he was an Edomite. That's even worse than not being a Jew. But they're the ones that God said were the most righteous. And then, of course, poor old Job says, "Why didn't I perish at birth and die as I came out of the womb? Why were there knees to receive me and breasts that I might be nursed? For now I would be lying down in peace. I would be asleep and at rest." And I've got a few more passages here. I won't read them. We all know Job's lament. He said, "I'd rather be dead, God, than suffering what I'm suffering now. Why has this happened? I've done everything right. I've done everything that you've asked. I even have sacrificed in case my children have committed sins. Why am I suffering?" He had no concept of why he was suffering. And by the time you get to chapter 38 and 39 and down to 41, he never knows. God never told him that he was suffering toward the conversion of Satan. He was suffering for the sake of someone else. He'd imposed a meaning, and the friends had imposed a meaning that was totally wrong. He was suffering for Satan. And he was suffering for whoever that Satan was to bring him to God. Because Satan had said, "Has this person, Job, worship you just because he loves you? Or does he worship you for what he can get out of you?" And so God had tested Job and taken everything away from him. But Job never knew that. He never knew that he was a suffering servant, suffering to bring someone else to God. It was a meaning that we can give as we see him as an example of Jesus Christ, suffering for others, being righteous in himself. And when we look around ourselves, you'll see that people, even in our society, even outside Christianity, people try to make meaning out of things that happen in their life. I don't know whether you know, but I always think of the Abdullah family. Do you remember those kids who were killed? They were just going out to get ice creams, and some mad, drug-crazed driver ran over them and killed one family. 3 of these little kids killed in one family. And I can remember on that day, the father, Danny Abdullah, came out, and I was waiting for the anger. I was waiting for him to say all the things about how much he hated this driver. And his message was, drive carefully. And since then, they have got a commemorative day for those children in February called I Forgive. And that was the dedication. That's the meaning they put. That's the meaning they imposed on what happened. Daniel Morecambe's family created a charity in the memory of Daniel Morecambe. Rosie Batty created a charity in the name of Luke for his death. So even people outside of Christianity, they try to give meaning to events. But we, who know the plan of God and who can look forward to a kingdom where there will be no more tears and there'll be no more suffering and no more sadness, can impose upon things in our lives a meaning that brings us closer to God. I have a friend or two. I'm going to add to that. I don't mean I've just got a friend or two. I have a couple of friends, Christian friends, who lament the fact that they don't see God in their life. They say, I don't see God. God works in all the people in the Bible, and I don't see God in my life. You're not looking. There are so many things that happen in our lives where we can impose meaning. We can look at it and say, I can make meaning out of that. A blind child, I can make meaning out of that. A tower that falls and kills, I can make meaning out of that. And the meaning is that unless I cling on to Jesus Christ, I too will die. Every one of us will die unless we hold on to Jesus with the hope of everlasting life. Not only everlasting life, do you ever stop to think that the best thing about the kingdom is going to be this world will be healed? There'll be no more suffering. There'll be no more tsunamis. There'll be no more volcanoes in Tonga. We are going to live in a world of perfection where every tear is wiped from every eye. And the epitome of that is on that table. Jesus didn't have to impose meaning. He knew his meaning. He knew his destiny. He knew that he had the meaning for the whole human race in his hands. But for us, we don't have that destiny laid for us. What we need to do is just simply make sure that we look at our life and see in it the meaning that God meant. To see in it that God might be able to use our life. It was